The city was alive with its usual chaos, honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the distant hum of street vendors. Among the crowd, a homeless man shuffled slowly toward a grand glass building, First National Bank. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, and his eyes carried a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. People glanced at him, some with pity, others with irritation. He was used to it. For years, he had been invisible, just another face in the sea of the forgotten. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just passing by. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The air-conditioned breeze hit his face, a stark contrast to the summer heat outside. The bank was polished, marble floors, shiny counters, well-dressed employees. Every head turned as he walked in. Whispers followed him. A security guard stiffened, stepping forward. "Sir, do you need help?" His tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't welcoming either. The homeless man didn't flinch. "I'm here to see the manager." His voice was rough but firm. The guard hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" A few customers snickered. A homeless man asking for the bank manager? It had to be a joke. The man reached into his torn coat pocket. The guard tensed, hand hovering near his radio. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a yellowed, crumpled piece of paper. "Just tell him I'm here about this." The guard took the paper, eyes scanning it. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. He looked back at the man, then at the paper again. Without another word, he walked toward the manager's office. The bank's atmosphere grew tense. Tellers whispered behind their counters. Customers pretended not to stare but couldn't help glancing at the disheveled man standing calmly in the middle of the room. Minutes later, the manager, a tall man in a sharp suit, emerged, holding the paper. His face was unreadable. He approached the homeless man, studying him closely. "Where did you get this?" The homeless man met his gaze. "It was always mine." The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at the paper again, then back at the man. "You expect me to believe you own this bank?" A ripple of laughter spread through the bank. Even some of the employees couldn't hide their smirks. The idea was ridiculous. A homeless man owning one of the biggest banks in the city? Impossible. But the man didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. "Check your records." The manager hesitated. The confidence in the man's voice unsettled him. Something wasn't adding up. He turned to one of the employees. "Pull up the original ownership documents. Now." The laughter died down. An uneasy silence settled over the bank. Because if there was one thing everyone understood, money didn't lie. And the truth was about to come out. The bank manager's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his usual confidence replaced by hesitation. The homeless man stood silently, his eyes fixed on the computer screen as if he already knew what would appear. The employees had stopped pretending to work, everyone was watching now. The manager typed in the search, "Original ownership documents, First National Bank." The system took its time, loading slowly, as if reluctant to reveal the truth. Then, the screen flickered, and a scanned document appeared. The manager's breath caught. The document was old, the ink faded, but the name at the bottom was unmistakable. It matched the crumpled paper the homeless man had handed him. And the signature? Belonged to a man who had disappeared decades ago, a man who had once been one of the wealthiest in the city. The manager looked up, his face pale. This can't be right." The homeless man's voice was quiet but firm. "Check the dates. The transaction records. You'll see." A teller nearby whispered to a coworker, "What's happening?" No one answered. The air in the bank had grown heavy, thick with tension. The manager scrolled further, pulling up archived files. His hands trembled slightly. The deeper he dug, the more the pieces fell into place, transfers, legal loopholes, a name erased from history. His throat tightened. If this was real, then everything they knew about the bank's ownership was a lie. He turned back to the homeless man, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted to the bank's high ceiling, as if remembering something far away. Then, he spoke. 25 years ago, this bank was mine." Flashback, 25 years earlier. The city had been different then, smaller, less crowded. The man hadn't always been homeless. Once, he had worn tailored suits, driven luxury cars, and walked these same streets with people nodding in respect. He had built the bank from the ground up, pouring his life into it. Then, disaster struck. A business partner, someone he had trusted, had betrayed him. Fake documents, forged signatures, a sudden legal battle that drained his fortune. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. The courts ruled against him. The bank was taken. His name was dragged through the mud, his reputation destroyed. Overnight, he lost everything. No one believed him. Not the lawyers, not the judges, not even his own family. The betrayal cut so deep that he walked away from it all, disappearing into the streets, becoming just another faceless shadow in the city. For years, he wandered, surviving on scraps, forgotten by the world. But he never let go of one thing, the original deed to the bank, the one piece of proof that could undo the lies. He kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. And today was that moment. Back in the bank, present day. The manager's mouth was dry. The documents didn't lie. The homeless man's claims were real. But admitting that meant admitting something much darker, that the bank, for decades, had been built on a stolen legacy. The employees exchanged nervous glances. The customers, who had come in for simple transactions, were now witnessing something they couldn't ignore. One woman pulled out her phone, recording discreetly. The homeless man's voice cut through the silence. "I don't want money. I don't want revenge. I just want what's mine." The manager swallowed hard. This wasn't just about legal papers, it was about justice. And if the truth got out, the scandal would shake the entire city. He had a choice: deny everything and call the police, or listen. He made his decision. "We need to talk in private." The manager's office door clicked shut, muffling the murmurs from the bank lobby. The homeless man sat across from him, his posture straight despite his ragged clothes. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The manager slid a glass of water toward him. "You still haven't told me your name." The man took the glass but didn't drink. "Names don't matter anymore. What matters is the truth." The manager exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Even if what you're saying is true, even if you were the original owner, do you have any idea what you're up against? This bank hasn't been yours for decades. The people who control it now won't just hand it back." The homeless man's fingers tightened around the glass. "I know." A long silence stretched between them. The manager studied the man's face, the deep lines, the scars of a life lived in shadows. This wasn't some desperate scam. This man believed what he was saying. And worse, the documents backed him up. The manager leaned forward. "Why now? After all these years?" The man's gaze darkened. "Because I found something. Something they never wanted anyone to see. The hidden ledger." 3 weeks earlier, the homeless man had been sleeping under a bridge when heavy rains flooded the streets. As water rushed through the gutters, it dislodged a rusted metal box buried near the bank's old construction site. Inside was a ledger, handwritten, yellowed with age, filled with transactions that didn't match the bank's official records. Payoffs. Fake loans. Names of people who had been paid to lie in court. It was proof. Proof that the takeover hadn't just been betrayal, it had been stolen through fraud. The man's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. His old partner hadn't just ruined him, he had built an empire on lies. And the worst part? That partner was still out there. Somewhere. Now, sitting in the manager's office, he slid the ledger across the desk. "Read it." The manager hesitated, then opened it. His eyes darted across the pages, his face growing paler with each line. This can't be real." "It is," the man said quietly. "And you know what it means." It meant the bank's current owners weren't just unaware, they were complicit. The fraud had never stopped. It had just gotten bigger. The manager's hands trembled. If this got out, the scandal would destroy careers. Maybe even the bank itself. He looked up, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The homeless man leaned forward. "I want to talk to him." The shadow partner. The manager's blood ran cold. "You can't be serious." "He's still here," the man finished. "Still pulling the strings." "I know." The manager's mouth went dry. The real owner of the bank, the man who had orchestrated the takeover, had stayed hidden for years, letting others run things while he profited in silence. Few even knew his name anymore. But the homeless man knew. And now, he wanted a meeting. The manager gripped the edge of his desk. "If I set that up, I'm risking everything." The homeless man didn't blink. "You already are." A tense silence filled the room. The manager knew he was trapped. If he refused, the homeless man could take this story public. But if he agreed, he'd be walking into a storm. Finally, he picked up the phone. "I'll make the call." The call was brief. The manager's voice was low, careful, as if the walls themselves were listening. When he hung up, his hands were damp with sweat. "He'll see you," he said. "Tonight. But you're not going to like where." The homeless man didn't react. After years of sleeping on concrete, there was no place left that could unsettle him. "Where?" The manager hesitated. "The old docks. Warehouse 17. A flicker of recognition passed through the man's eyes. Warehouse 17, the same place where, decades ago, his company had stored documents before the takeover. Back then, it had been bustling with workers. Now, it was abandoned, forgotten. Just like him. Perfect. The meeting place. Night fell heavy over the city, the docks bathed in the sickly yellow glow of flickering streetlights. The homeless man walked slowly, his footsteps silent against the cracked pavement. The air smelled of salt and rust, of things left to rot. Warehouse 17 loomed ahead, its metal doors half open like a crooked grin. He stepped inside. The space was vast, empty except for a single chair in the center, illuminated by a hanging bulb. A figure sat there, back turned. "You came." The voice was older now, rougher, but unmistakable. The homeless man's chest tightened. After all these years, there he was. The figure turned. Time had not been kind to him. His hair was gray, his face lined with age and greed, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, were the same. The eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime taking what wasn't his. The homeless man didn't move. "You look terrible." A dry chuckle. "And you smell like the street." Silence stretched between them, thick with decades of hatred. The man in the chair sighed. "Let's skip the drama. You found the ledger. So what? It's been 25 years. No court will care now." The homeless man took a step forward. "I don't need a court. The truth comes out." The man in the chair smirked. "Then what? You want money? A cut of the business?" He spread his hands. "Fine. I'll write you a check tonight. Consider it charity." The homeless man's voice was ice. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? The truth. The man in the chair stilled. About what? Why me? The homeless man's hands clenched. You could have stolen from anyone. Why me? For the first time, the man in the chair looked uneasy. He glanced toward the shadows, too quickly, before forcing a laugh. Does it matter? You lost. I won. That's how the world works. But the homeless man wasn't buying it. He took another step. No. This was personal. And I think I finally know why. He reached into his coat. The man in the chair tensed, eyes darting to the darkness again. Was he expecting someone? A bodyguard? A killer? But the homeless man only pulled out a photograph, old, creased. He held it up. A younger version of them stood side by side, smiling. Brothers. The man in the chair went very still. The homeless man's voice cracked. You were my family. And you destroyed me for what? The real betrayal. The answer came from the shadows. For her. A woman stepped into the light. She was older now, her once dark hair streaked with silver, but her face, was the same. The homeless man's breath left him in a rush. His wife. The one who had vanished the same week he lost the bank. The one he thought had left him. The one standing beside his brother. She didn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry. The man in the chair, his brother, smirked. She chose me. And the bank was just a bonus. The truth hit like a knife. It had never been about money. It had been about him. The homeless man swayed, the warehouse spinning around him. All these years, he'd believed he lost everything to greed. But it was worse. He'd lost it to hate. The warehouse felt like it was closing in around him. The homeless man stared at his wife, standing beside his brother like none of the past 25 years had happened. Like she hadn't vanished. Like he hadn't spent decades believing she was dead. His voice came out raw. You were alive this whole time. She flinched but didn't deny it. His brother, the man who had stolen his life, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. Surprise. The homeless man's hands shook. He wanted to scream. To lunge at them both. But the years on the streets had taught him one thing: rage makes you stupid. So he forced himself to breathe. To think. Why? He asked, looking only at her. Why disappear? Why let me think? His brother cut in. She didn't let you think anything. You just assumed. The woman, his wife, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The night she vanished. 25 years earlier. She had been waiting for him in their penthouse, dressed in a coat she never usually wore. When he walked in, she didn't smile. We need to leave. Tonight. He had laughed, thinking it was a joke. They had everything, money, power, the bank he'd built from nothing. Why would they run? Then she told him the truth. His brother had been stealing. Not just from the bank, from him. And not just money. Documents. Contracts. Proof that could ruin them both. She had found out by accident. And when she confronted his brother, he didn't deny it. He just smiled and said one word. Oops. That was when she knew. He wasn't just stealing. He was setting them up. The choice. Back in the warehouse, the homeless man felt the past and present crash together. You knew, he said slowly. You knew he was going to frame me. His wife nodded. I tried to warn you. You didn't believe me. He remembered that night now, how she had begged him to listen, how he had brushed her off, too focused on an upcoming deal. By morning, she was gone. And so was everything else. His brother chuckled. You always underestimated me. Thought I was just the fun one. The one who didn't care about business. He spread his hands. Turns out, I was just better at hiding it. The homeless man ignored him, his eyes locked on his wife. Where did you go? She hesitated. Away. Somewhere he couldn't use me against you. But he did use you, the homeless man said, the pieces finally clicking. He made sure everyone thought you left because of me. That I drove you away. His brother smirked. And it worked, didn't it? After she left, no one questioned when the bank started failing. They just assumed you fell apart. The cruelty of it hit like a punch. His brother hadn't just stolen his money. He'd stolen his name. The trap. The homeless man took a step forward. And now? Why show yourself now? His brother's smirk faded. For the first time, he looked uneasy. Because you wouldn't let it go. You had to dig. Had to find that damn ledger. The homeless man glanced at his wife. She was staring at the ground, her shoulders tense. That was when he realized. She wasn't here by choice. His brother had brought her as a threat. A warning. The homeless man's voice dropped to a whisper. What did you do to her? His brother stood, his chair scraping against the concrete. Nothing. Yet. But if you keep pushing? If you try to take back what's mine? He shrugged. Well. Accidents happen. The threat hung in the air, ugly and final. The homeless man looked at his wife. Really looked. The way her fingers trembled. The fear in her eyes. She wasn't his enemy. She was a prisoner. And his brother had just made one fatal mistake. He'd shown his hand. The homeless man didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on his wife's face, searching for any flicker of the woman he once knew. She was still in there, trapped behind the fear. His brother had controlled her for years, but that ended tonight. His brother misread the silence. Smart. You finally learned when to walk away. He gestured toward the warehouse doors. Leave the ledger, and this never happened. Go back to your cardboard box. Forget you ever saw her. The homeless man almost laughed. Forget? After 25 years of surviving on scraps, of being treated like garbage? No. He was done running. But he didn't say that. Instead, he nodded slowly, playing along. And if I refuse? His brother's smile turned vicious. He reached into his jacket, a gun. Then I'll make sure you don't leave at all. The wife gasped. Stop it. You promised. Shut up, his brother snapped, not even looking at her. That was the moment the homeless man saw his opening. His brother had always been arrogant. Careless. And right now, he was too focused on the threat in front of him to notice the one behind. The homeless man let his shoulders slump, feigning defeat. Fine. You win. He reached into his coat, slowly, and pulled out the ledger. His brother's eyes lit up with greed. Finally. Hand it. Crack. A pipe came down hard on his brother's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. The wife stood there, breathing hard, the metal pipe still in her hands. His brother howled in pain, clutching his wrist. You bitch. The homeless man didn't hesitate. He lunged, tackling his brother to the ground. They rolled, fists flying, years of rage exploding in the dim light. His brother fought dirty, nails, elbows, a knee to the gut, but the homeless man had spent decades surviving streets that didn't forgive weakness. He punched harder. His brother's nose broke with a sickening crunch. The ledger's secret. Panting, the homeless man stood, wiping blood from his split lip. His brother groaned on the ground, cursing weakly. The wife hadn't moved. She stared at the ledger where it had fallen, her face pale. "You don't know what's in there, do you?" she whispered. The homeless man picked it up. "Proof he stole the bank." She shook her head. "It's worse." She flipped to a page near the back, one he hadn't seen before. A list of names. Dates. Amounts. Payoffs to city officials. Bribes to judges. And at the bottom, circled in red. "If anything happens to me, release this. Burn them all." The homeless man's blood ran cold. This wasn't just proof of fraud. It was a kill switch. His brother had been blackmailing half the city for decades. And now, they had it. The real enemy. His brother laughed weakly from the floor, blood trickling from his nose. "You think you've won? Those people own this city. Cops. Lawyers. Politicians. They'll bury you before you take a single step toward court." The homeless man looked at his wife. "Is he right?" She hesitated, then nodded. "They'll protect him. They have to." Silence filled the warehouse. The homeless man stared at the ledger, the names burning into his mind. His brother wasn't just a thief. He was a cancer. And cancers had to be cut out. The choice. The wife touched his arm. "We could run. Take the ledger to the press. Let the world see." "And then what?" his brother spat. "You'll be dead in a week." The homeless man ignored him. He looked at his wife, really looked, for the first time in 25 years. "Do you trust me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." He made his decision. "Then we don't run." He picked up the gun. "We fight." The gun felt heavy in the homeless man's hand. He'd never liked weapons, violence had only ever taken from him, but tonight, it might be the only language his brother's allies understood. His wife's fingers tightened around his arm. "What's the plan?" He glanced at the ledger, then at his brother groaning on the floor. "We don't take this to the cops. We take it to them." Her eyes widened. "The people on that list? They'll kill us. Not if they think we're the only ones who can save them." His brother let out a wet, bloody laugh. "You're insane. They'll never believe you." The homeless man crouched beside him, gripping his collar. "Then you're going to make them." The first move. An hour later, they stood outside a sleek downtown high-rise, home to one of the most powerful names on the ledger. A man who had taken bribes to look the other way while the bank was stolen. The wife hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" The homeless man wasn't. But he knew one thing, fear was a stronger motivator than justice. He pulled out his brother's phone, taken from his unconscious body, and dialed. The line picked up on the second ring. A smooth, polished voice answered. "You're calling late." The homeless man took a breath. "We have the ledger." Silence. Then, sharp and cold, "Who is this?" "The man your friend tried to destroy. And if you want to keep your name out of the press, you'll meet us. Now." A pause. Then an address. They had taken the bait. The meeting. The penthouse was all glass and cold marble, the kind of place the homeless man would have been thrown out of a week ago. The politician, gray-haired, impeccably dressed, didn't offer them a seat. "Where is he?" "Safe," the homeless man said. "For now." The man's lip curled. "You're bluffing." He'd never let that ledger out of his hands. The wife stepped forward, holding up the phone. A video played, his brother, bruised but conscious, confirming every dirty deal on the list. The politician paled. The homeless man pressed his advantage. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call everyone on this list. And you're going to tell them one thing, the game's over. The dominoes fall. One by one, they came. The judge who'd ruled against him all those years ago. The cops who'd looked the other way. The bankers who'd laundered the money. Each one arrived furious, then terrified when they saw the ledger. The homeless man stood before them, no longer the broken man they'd ignored. You have two choices. You help us undo what he did, all of it, or the world finds out what you really are. The judge, sweating, spoke first. And if we agree? Then when this is over, you walk away. But the bank? The money? That's mine. Silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. It was almost too easy. That should have been his first warning. The trap. They were halfway out the door when the politician finally spoke again. You know he'll never let this stand. The homeless man turned. He doesn't have a choice. The man smiled, a thin, dangerous thing. Everyone has a choice. The elevator doors closed. The wife gripped his arm. Something's wrong. He felt it too. The deal had been too smooth. Too quick. Then his brother's phone buzzed. A single text. Wrong move. The elevator shuddered, then the lights went out. The elevator jerked to a stop, plunging them into darkness. Somewhere above, alarms began blaring, sharp, panicked shrieks that echoed through the shaft. The wife's breath came fast in the blackness. They're locking down the building. The homeless man didn't answer. He was listening to something else, the faint, metallic click from the elevator's ceiling panel. Someone was up there. He shoved her behind him just as the panel dropped open. A muzzle flash lit the darkness. Bang! The bullet tore past his ear, embedding in the wall. He lunged, grabbing the shooter's arm and yanking hard. A man crashed down onto them, not a cop. Private security. His brother's men. They fought in the cramped space, elbows and knees slamming into metal. The homeless man got a hand around the gun. Bang! The shot went wide, ricocheting off the walls. The wife screamed. The attacker gasped as the homeless man drove a fist into his throat, then wrenched the weapon free. Silence. Then, from the man's radio, target contained. Proceed. His brother's voice. The homeless man's blood ran cold. This was never about stopping them. It was about stalling. The truth comes out. The elevator suddenly lurched back to life, descending rapidly. The doors opened to a basement garage, empty except for 3 black SUVs. And his brother. Standing there. Smiling. Blood still crusted his nose, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. You really thought you could win? The homeless man raised the gun. It's over. The whole city knows what you did. His brother laughed. No. They know what you did. He pulled out a phone and played a video, the homeless man holding a gun to the politician's head. Doctored footage. By morning, you'll be the most wanted man in the state, his brother said softly. And her? He nodded to the wife. Well. Accidents happen. The SUV doors opened. More armed men stepped out. The homeless man's fingers tightened on the gun. Think. His brother had planned for everything. Except one thing. The final play. The homeless man did the one thing his brother never expected. He lowered the gun. And smiled. You're right, he said. I lose. His brother's smirk faltered. This wasn't part of the script. Then. Sirens. Police cars screeched into the garage, lights flashing. Reporters. Cameras. Dozens of them. His brother whirled. What is this? The homeless man pulled out his own phone, the one he'd taken from the politician, still recording. Live streaming. Meet your audience, he said. For the first time in 25 years, his brother looked scared. Justice, at last. It unraveled fast after that. The cops, real cops, not his brother's men, moved in. The reporters shouted questions. The video of the ledger, of his brother's confession, played on loop for the cameras. His brother screamed, lunging, and was tackled to the ground. As they dragged him away, he locked eyes with the homeless man one last time. This isn't over. But it was. Epilogue, 1 year later. The bank's grand reopening was front-page news. The homeless man, no longer homeless, stood at the entrance, his wife beside him. The brother was in prison. The corrupt politicians? Disgraced. And the bank? His again. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. What's next? He looked at his wife, then at the crowd, the city that had forgotten him, and smiled. We rebuild.